Welcome to our channel, where the stories of people from different eras and professions come to life. We are in magnificent Ephesus, right by the sea, where the great temple of Artemis reaches toward the heavens, and ships from all over the world fill the harbor. Subscribe, and after listening, be sure to share your impressions in the comments.
Leads to greatness in big ones. Legend says that during Numa's reign, a shield of unusual shape called the Ancile fell from the sky. It was perceived as a sign that the gods were handing Rome a pledge of its invincibility. So that no one could steal this sacred object, Numa ordered a skilled craftsman to make 11 more exactly like it. A college of Salii, the leaping priests, was created to guard them. Every year in spring, they performed a solemn procession through the city, executing ritual dances in armor and singing hymns whose words eventually became incomprehensible even to the Romans themselves, but which were invariably performed as a tribute to ancient tradition. Numa Pompilius's reign lasted 43 years. Throughout this entire time, the gates of the Temple of Janus, which were closed only in periods of complete peace, never opened. Rome prospered without a single battle. Neighboring peoples, seeing the wisdom and calmness of the Romans, stopped viewing them as robbers and began seeking friendship with them. Numa proved that myth can create no worse than a sword, and ritual can unite people more firmly than any military discipline. Numa died of old age, surrounded by the love of his people. According to his will, he was not cremated, but buried in a stone sarcophagus on the Janiculum Hill. Next to him were placed his sacred books, in which he recorded all the rites he had established. It is believed that it was Numa who laid the foundation of Roman religion that would last for more than 1,000 years. He turned Rome from an accidental settlement into the sacred center of the world, where every step of a citizen was connected with the will of the gods. If Romulus gave Rome a body, then Numa Pompilius breathed a soul into it. His image remained through the ages as the ideal of a philosopher-ruler. He showed that the true greatness of a state lies not only in the territory it controls, but also in the depth of its spiritual foundations. After his death, Rome would return to warriors and conquests. But now, every warrior would carry in his heart the knowledge that behind him stand the gods, whose rights and duties were clearly defined by the wise second king. After Numa Pompilius established the rites and accustomed the people to piety, Rome was ready to accept the highest form of state cult. The city was no longer just a gathering of shepherds and warriors. It was becoming a powerful political organism that required heavenly patrons of corresponding scale. Thus, on the summit of the most important of the 7 hills, faith in the Capitoline Triad began to take shape. This union of 3 great deities, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, became not only a religious symbol, but also the embodiment of the very idea of Roman statehood and the inviolability of power. The central place in this triad, and in the entire Roman pantheon, belonged to Jupiter, whom they called Optimus Maximus, which translates as best and greatest. For a Roman, Jupiter was not simply the god of thunder or the sky. He was the supreme guardian of justice, the guarantor of oaths, and the chief patron of the state. His power was boundless, and his will determined the fates of nations. The Romans believed that their dominion over the world was a direct consequence of their devotion to Jupiter. In his hands were clutched bundles of lightning with which he punished violators of laws and those who neglected sacred oaths. Every time a general returned with victory, he marched in a solemn procession precisely to Jupiter to pay him homage and acknowledge that the true author of the victory was the god, not the man. The second in this sacred union was Juno, the majestic wife of Jupiter. In the Capitoline cult, she appeared as Juno Regina, that is, the queen. If Jupiter was responsible for external order and power, then Juno was the patroness of the very fabric of Roman society. She protected women, marriage, and motherhood, ensuring the continuation of Roman lineages. But her role was wider than the domestic circle. As queen of the gods, she was considered the defender of state finances and advisor in difficult times. The Romans believed that Juno, with her vigilant gaze, guarded the walls of the city, warning of danger. Her presence in the triad gave the necessary fullness, connecting the masculine strength of power with the feminine wisdom of preserving life and traditions.
The third figure of the triad was Minerva, a goddess whose importance for Rome cannot be overestimated. Unlike the warlike Mars, Minerva personified wisdom, strategic thinking, and mastery. She was the patroness of arts, crafts, and school education. In union with Jupiter and Juno, she was responsible for reasonable governance and the intellectual power of the state. The Romans considered that victories were won not only by the strength of muscles, but also by the strength of mind granted by Minerva. She taught people to build strong houses, weave clothes, and, most importantly, to think clearly and consistently. Without her participation, the triad would have lost its creative beginning. For the placement of these great powers on the Capitoline Hill, a grandiose temple was erected. Its construction began under the last kings and became a project of incredible scale. The temple of the Capitoline Triad was not just a building of stone and wood. It became the sacred heart of the entire Roman world. Under one roof were located 3 separate cellae or sanctuaries. The central one belonged to Jupiter and the side ones to Juno and Minerva. This architectural solution emphasized the unity of the 3 deities in the protection of Rome. The walls of the temple were decorated with trophies brought from conquered countries, and its roof shone with gilding visible from the most distant corners of the city. There is a myth associated with the laying of the foundation of this temple. It is said that when the builders began to dig the earth on the hill, they discovered deep in the soil a human head with facial features that seemed alive and untouched by decay. The augurs and priests interpreted this as the most important omen. They proclaimed that this place would become the head of the world and that Rome would rule the entire earth.
It was from this event, according to legend, that the hill received its name Capitol, from the Latin word caput, meaning head. This mystical justification gave the Romans unshakable confidence in their right to world domination. The Capitoline Temple played a key role in political life. It was here that new consuls took office every year on January 1st. Before proceeding to govern the state, they offered sacrifices to Jupiter, acknowledging his supremacy. Foreign ambassadors were received here, and the sacred Sibylline books were kept here, to which the Senate turned in moments of greatest crises. The Capitol was a symbol of stability. The Romans said that while the capital stands, Rome will stand, and while Rome stands, the world will stand. This hill became for them tangible proof that the gods had chosen this very city as their earthly home. An important element of the worship of the Triad was public games and festivals.
The great Roman games were dedicated to Jupiter, the best and greatest. On these days, the whole city turned into one large religious community. Chariot races in the hippodromes, theatrical performances, and solemn feasts were not just entertainment, but a form of service to the gods. The Romans believed that the gods rejoiced together with people, and the more magnificent the holiday, the more favorable the heavens would be. The Capitoline Triad demanded from its charges not secret mysticism, but open, majestic, and orderly expressions of faith. The cult of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva also performed an important unifying function. As Rome expanded its borders, in every new city founded by the Romans, a capital was built, a temple repeating the structure of the main sanctuary on the 7 hills. This allowed inhabitants of the most distant provinces to feel their involvement in the empire.
Worship of the Capitoline Triad became a kind of civic duty. Recognizing these gods meant loyalty to the Roman state and its laws. Thus, the mythology of the Triad turned into the ideological cement that bound diverse peoples under the power of Rome. However, for all their grandeur, the Capitoline gods remained majestic and distant from the everyday needs of an individual person. Jupiter cared for the state, Juno for the people as a whole, Minerva for the progress of civilization. But the ordinary Roman, returning after a working day to his modest home, needed protection of a different kind. He needed deities who would know his name, guard his pantry, and protect his children from nighttime fears. Therefore, while paying due respect to the great Triad at the top of the hill, every inhabitant of Rome simultaneously honored completely different gods, quiet, invisible, and very close. The great temples of the capital and lavish state festivals constituted only the external side of Roman life. Beyond the threshold of every home, in the silence of the family circle, completely different forces reigned. If Jupiter ruled the world, then the everyday life of a Roman was guided by small gods whose presence was felt in every household action. Roman faith was permeated with the idea that everything around was endowed with its own sacred power. This minor mythology was much closer and more understandable to the ordinary person than the majestic Olympian images. It formed the very essence of the Roman worldview, turning every dwelling into a small sanctuary. The most revered protectors of the family were the lares. The Romans believed that the lares were the benevolent souls of ancestors who had not left their family but remained to guard the house and its inhabitants. In every home there was a lararium, a small niche or cabinet where figurines of these deities stood. Usually the lares were depicted as young men in short tunics holding a cornucopia or a cup. Every morning, the head of the family offered them prayers, and on holidays, the figurines were decorated with wreaths of flowers. It was believed that the lares watched over order in the house, punished negligent servants, and protected the household from diseases. They were invisible witnesses to all family events, weddings, births, and funerals. Leaving home, a Roman would enter the domain of the god Janus. This was one of the most ancient and revered deities of Italy, with no direct analogues in Greek mythology. Janus was depicted with two faces, one looking forward into the future and the other backward into the past. He was the god of all entrances and exits, doors and gates, as well as any beginning. No important matter began without a prayer to Janus. He was considered the keeper of the keys to heaven and earth. In Rome stood the famous Temple of Janus, which was a double arch with doors.
These doors were open when Rome was at war
and closed only in rare periods of complete peace. Janus taught the Romans that every ending is merely a new beginning, and that wisdom lies in the ability to see both sides of any event. In addition to these main figures, the Roman world was inhabited by a countless multitude of minor deities responsible for the narrowest spheres of life. There was the god Vaticanus, who helped a child utter its first cry, the goddess Cunina, who guarded the cradle, and the god Sterculinius, who oversaw the fertilization of fields. There were gods of doors. Forculus protected the panels, Cardia the hinges, and Limentinus the threshold. To a modern person, this may seem excessive, but for a Roman, it was a way to make the world predictable and safe. If every action had its own god, then, through the correct ritual, one could come to an agreement with any force of nature. The Romans treated their minor gods with remarkable practicality. Their relations were built on the principle, I give so that you may give. A person offered a sacrifice or performed a rite, expecting in return specific help, protection of the harvest from drought, healing of a sick child, or success in a trade deal. In this mythology, there was no room for mystical ecstasy or deep philosophical reflections. It was a religion of duty, discipline, and mutual obligations. The minor gods demanded not so much love as precise execution of formalities. If the rite was performed without a single mistake, the god was obliged to help. This grassroots mythology proved extremely resilient. Even when the official cults of Jupiter and Mars began to lose significance, faith in the Lares and Penates continued to live among the people. It permeated rural life, surviving in the form of omens and traditions for many centuries. Household deities made Roman culture very down-to-earth, in the good sense of the word, and very human. They linked generations of people into a single chain, where deceased ancestors continued to live in the form of Lares, and future descendants were already invisibly present in the cares of the Penates. The world of minor mythology was a quiet and unnoticeable one, but it was precisely this that shaped the character of the Roman citizen. Respect for household gods gave birth to respect for paternal authority and state law. The ability to negotiate with the god of the threshold taught discipline and accuracy in affairs. The Romans believed that the greatness of the empire rested on a solid foundation of millions of such small sanctuaries. If in every house the fire of Vesta burns and the Lares are honored, then the entire state is under reliable protection. As Roman legions advanced south across the Apennine Peninsula and beyond its borders, Rome encountered a culture that was much older and richer than its own. This was the culture of ancient Greece. Until that moment, Roman mythology had been strict, practical, and largely devoid of elaborate plots. Italian gods were perceived more as invisible forces or functions than as personalities with vivid biographies. However, the encounter with the Greek world forever changed the face of Roman faith. A long process began that historians call Hellenization. It was not merely the borrowing of foreign names, but a great merging of two different ways of perceiving the divine. The Romans possessed an amazing ability to absorb everything useful and beautiful they found in other peoples. When they became acquainted with Greek poetry, theater, and sculpture, they were struck by how alive and human the Greek gods appeared. The Greeks told endless stories of love, intrigue, exploits, and adventures of their Olympians. The Romans, whose faith until then had been based on precise execution of rituals and observance of duty, suddenly saw in these stories an opportunity to give their religion new depth and brilliance. They began to seek correspondences between their ancient deities and Greek characters. The first and most natural was the identification of Jupiter with Zeus. Both were lords of the sky and thunderers. The ancient Italian Jupiter, who had previously been only a guarantor of oaths and a stern judge, suddenly acquired Zeus's entire rich genealogy. He was attributed participation in the Titanomachy, the overthrow of his father, and numerous unions with mortal women. His wife Juno came to be perceived as a copy of the majestic Hera, adopting her features of a jealous and imperious queen of the gods. Thus, a Roman pantheon of 12 main gods gradually formed, almost completely copying the composition of the inhabitants of the Greek Olympus. Mars, who originally was an ancient Italian god of fertility and protector of the fields, gradually merged with the Greek Ares. For the Romans, this was not an easy transformation, because Mars in Rome enjoyed deep respect as the father of Romulus and defender of the state, while the Greek Ares was often depicted as an unrestrained and even mad god of war, whom the Greeks themselves did not particularly like. The Romans managed to preserve the nobility of their Mars while endowing him with the armor and fury of his Greek counterpart. Similarly, Minerva merged with Athena Pallas, adopting her role as the goddess of wisdom and patroness of just wars. The process of merging affected every god. Venus, who among the ancient Latins was a modest goddess of gardens and spring flowering, transformed into the dazzling Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. This transformation was of enormous importance for Rome.
Through Venus, the Romans strengthened their connection with Aeneas and Troy, justifying their right to greatness by the divine origin of their people. Mercury, the god of trade and profit, became identified with Hermes, the messenger of the gods, acquiring his winged sandals and the role of conductor of souls to the realm of the dead. Even Neptune, who originally was the god of fresh waters and rivers, turned into the mighty lord of the seas Poseidon, receiving his famous trident in his hands. An important tool of this merging was literature. Roman poets such as Livius Andronicus and later the great Virgil began to translate Greek epics into Latin, adapting them to Roman realities. They replaced Greek names with Latin ones, but preserved all the plot twists. Thus, Greek mythology became the basis of Roman education. Young Romans from noble families learned by heart verses in which the gods acted, suffered, and rejoiced, just as in the legends of Hellas. This created a single cultural space that united the entire Mediterranean under the power of Rome. However, Hellenization was not simple copying. The Romans always added their own special emphasis to the myths. They paid much more attention to morality and civic duty. If Greek gods often acted out of personal whims, Roman authors tried to show that even in mythical times, divine intervention served the good of the state. The Romans took the Greek form but filled it with their own stern content. They turned myth into a tool for educating the ideal citizen. The gods became examples of how to observe contracts and how to punish betrayal. Special place in this process was occupied by the so-called Greek cults that were officially adopted in Rome. For example, the cult of Apollo came to Rome directly from Greece without a direct Italian predecessor. Apollo became for the Romans the god of healing, prophecy, and the arts. Magnificent temples were built in his honor, and he was considered one of the most revered patrons of Roman culture. The same happened with the cult of Aesculapius, the god of medicine, who was brought to Rome in the form of a sacred snake during a terrible epidemic. The Romans believed that accepting foreign gods only strengthened their own city, making its protection more reliable. Hellenization led to Roman mythology becoming visual. Previously in Italy, statues of gods were rarely created. Instead, they preferred to worship them in sacred groves or before simple altars. Under the influence of the Greeks, Rome filled with images of deities in the form of beautiful men and women. These statues made the gods closer to people, but at the same time turned religion into a theatrical spectacle. Temples began to resemble museums, where contemplation of works of art was performed alongside prayers. This contributed to the flourishing of crafts and turned Rome into the most beautiful capital of that time. The Great Merger also had consequences for people's consciousness. On the one hand, mythology became much richer and more interesting. On the other hand, it began to lose its original sacredness. When a god becomes a character in an engaging poem, it is easier to believe in him as a symbol, but harder as a real, formidable force. Educated Romans began to perceive myths as allegories or beautiful fairy tales, while the common people continued to hold on to the ancient Italian rites. This created a certain gap between the official state religion and the personal faith of each person. Nevertheless, it was thanks to Hellenization that Roman mythology was able to survive the centuries. If it had remained a set of dry rituals of Numa Pompilius, it might have disappeared along with the fall of Rome. But by merging with Greek genius, it turned into that classical mythology that still inspires artists and thinkers to this day. Rome preserved the Greek myths for history, systematized them, and gave them the state significance that they lacked in the fragmented Greek city-states. By the 1st century BC, Rome had transformed from a small city on the Tiber into a colossal empire spanning 3 parts of the world. The old republican traditions and myths born in the tight circle of Italian communities
could no longer fully hold together such vast territories. The state needed a new symbol that would be understandable both to a resident of Gaul and to a merchant from Egypt. This symbol became the very person of the ruler. The transition from republic to empire marked the birth of the last great Roman myth, the myth of the divine emperor and the eternal mission of Rome. The central figure of this process was Octavian Augustus, the grandnephew and heir of Julius Caesar. After decades of bloody civil wars, the people longed for peace and stability. Augustus understood that the strength of his power should rely not only on legions, but also on sacred authority. He began a large-scale program of reviving ancient cults, which we would today call an ideological reform. Augustus built new temples and restored forgotten rites of Numa Pompilius, presenting himself as the restorer of the golden olden times. But behind this return to the roots lay something completely new, the gradual transformation of a living person into an object of divine worship. The first step was the official deification of Julius Caesar. The Senate proclaimed him the divine Julius, and a bright comet supposedly appeared in the sky above Rome, which the people took for the soul of Caesar ascending to Olympus. Octavian Augustus received the title Son of the Divine, which instantly elevated him above all other mortals. His name Augustus meant sacred or exalted by the gods. This was not just a title. It was an indication that through the emperor, divine grace flowed to earth, ensuring peace and prosperity. Augustus masterfully used art and literature to strengthen his mythical status. It was at this time that the poet Virgil wrote the Aeneid, the great epic we discussed in the earlier chapters. This work finally linked the family of Augustus with the hero Aeneas and his mother, the goddess Venus. Thus, the emperor's power was presented not as the result of political intrigue, but as the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy given by the gods back in the days of Troy's fall. The Romans began to believe that their entire history had been only a long preparation for the coming of Augustus, who was to return the lost golden age of Saturn to the world. Throughout the empire, altars and temples began to be erected not only to traditional gods, but also to the genius of Augustus and the goddess Roma, the personification of the city itself. This was a brilliant political move. Worship of the emperor became equivalent to an oath of allegiance to the state. If a person made a sacrifice before the statue of Augustus, he confirmed his loyalty to Rome. The imperial cult became the very glue that united hundreds of different peoples under one authority. Gods of the provinces began to be identified with Roman ones, but above them all now stood a living god in a purple toga, residing in his palace on the Palatine Hill. The death of Augustus only cemented this mythological construction. The Senate officially recognized him as a god and numbered him among the host of celestials. From that moment on, every worthy emperor after his death underwent the rite of apotheosis, transformation into a god. An eagle was released into the sky, which was supposed to carry the ruler's soul to the stars. Thus, an entire heavenly hierarchy of former earthly lords emerged. This gave the empire a sense of eternity. People believed that even if the emperor died, the divine force of power, the majestas, remained unchanged and passed to his successor under the patronage of Jupiter. The myth of the eternal city, Roma Eterna, became the culmination of all Roman mythology. If earlier gods could abandon the city in case of defeat, now it was believed that the fate of Rome and the fate of the universe were inseparably linked. Rome was no longer perceived as just a geographical point. It became a sacred space, a symbol of order opposing barbarian chaos. The Roman myth proclaimed that the empire would have no end and that under the rule of Rome, all nations would find a single law and peace. It was a powerful idea that inspired legionaries on the borders and officials in distant provinces. However, the deification of emperors also had its dark side. When a person's power is declared divine, any whim of his can become sacred law.
The history of Rome knew emperors such as Caligula or Nero who used this myth to justify their madness and tyranny. They demanded worship of themselves as living gods during their lifetime, violating the fragile balance between civic duty and religious feeling. Such periods became a severe test for Roman faith, but the very idea of the divinity of the empire remained unshakable until the arrival of new religious movements. The imperial cult existed for hundreds of years, adapting to changing conditions. Even when Eastern beliefs, such as the cult of Mithras or the invincible sun, began to penetrate the empire, they ultimately wove themselves into the general fabric of the state myth. The figure of the emperor remained central, combining the functions of high priest and earthly lord. This was the logical conclusion of the path begun once by Saturn.
Mythology had traveled from stories about the fertility of the earth and household spirits to a grandiose concept of world domination sanctified by the heavens. When we look at the history of Roman myths as a whole, we see an amazing picture. The Romans did not simply believe in the gods, they made the gods work for the benefit of their state. They turned myth into a legal document, into military discipline, and into an architectural plan. From the golden age of Saturn through the wanderings of Aeneas and the blood of the founding brothers, Rome moved toward its main destiny, to become the center of the world. The gods of Rome were stern, demanding, and just like the Roman people themselves. Today, when we visit the ruins of the Forum or look at the majestic dome of the Pantheon, we see traces of this great mythological system. It did not disappear without a trace. Many of our ideas about law, the state, the calendar, and even the very idea of civilization have their roots in those ancient rites established by Numa Pompilius and in the legends sung by Virgil. Roman mythology proved that ideas can be more enduring than stone. The eternal city ceased to be the capital of the empire, but it remained eternal in the memory of humanity as a symbol of what a people firmly believing in their divine destiny is capable of. Roman mythology proved that ideas can be more enduring than stone. The eternal city ceased to be the capital of the empire, but it remained eternal in the memory of humanity as a symbol of what a people firmly believing in their divine destiny is capable of. Unexpected tragic turn. Centuries later, across the vast ocean, a young republic, the United States of America, looked to Rome as its guiding light. They built their own capital, named their upper house the Senate, embraced the ideal of a balanced republic, and pursued a manifest destiny they believed was blessed by divine providence. American founders saw themselves as new Romans, bringing law, order, and liberty to a wild continent, echoing the journey from Saturn's golden age through Aeneas's trials to Romulus's iron will. Yet, history repeated its cruel pattern. What began as a noble experiment in freedom and virtue slowly echoed Rome's own fall. Internal divisions, the thirst for power, endless wars justified as spreading civilization, the slow erosion of republican virtues into imperial ambitions, and the replacement of ancient pietas with new idols of wealth and spectacle. All this led the American dream down a path frighteningly similar to the one that once turned the eternal city from a beacon of order into a hollow monument. The republic that dreamed of becoming a new Rome discovered too late that empires, even those born of the highest ideals, carry within themselves the seeds of their own tragic decline.